If those taking part in that debate would care to leave the chamber reasonably speedily, we now come to a debate entitled The NHS Treatment for Depersonalisation Disorder. Lynn Brown.
I'm very grateful, Mr Gray, and it's an absolute pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. In the 2017 Christmas adjournment debate, I spoke about the issue of depersonalisation disorder, or DPD. I told some of the story of my constituent Jane, and I requested a meeting to discuss NHS treatment of DPD. Since then, the Minister has kindly met with me and Jane and Dr Hunter, Elaine Hunter, a leading DPD clinician. It was a very sympathetic meeting, and I thank the Minister for that. And we agreed, both of us, that we would follow this up with a short Westminster Hall debate in order to speak publicly about why this issue is so important. So I'm going to take this opportunity to talk about depersonalisation and put a couple of, I hope, very gentle asks on the table. So what is depersonalisation? DPD can be triggered by a traumatic experience, a panic attack, stress, or indeed by drug use. It is a fairly common psychological mental process for dealing with trauma. Your mind feels like it is detaching from your body, and you feel as if you're outside yourself. Everything feels rather unreal. And I know that I've certainly felt that way before at a time of, significant and severe stress. Depersonalisation, though, is an intensified version of that feeling, and it isn't temporary. And it sets in indefinitely. It's often accompanied by the sensation of noticing yourself as if from the outside, as if you're a character on a screen, almost a character in the play of your life. This feeling can be so strong that those who have DPD are less aware of their own bodily sensations, like, for instance, their heartbeat. It's different from a psychosis, such as schizophrenia, because people with DPD are aware that the experience is subjective and not something that is changing in the world around them. A common difficulty for those with DPD is putting that experience into words. Many use metaphors or similes, comparing their experience to watching a TV screen, or adjectives like fuzzy or blurry in order to describe how they feel. The lack of awareness about the condition, combined with the difficulty in communicating the precise symptoms, is why many are repeatedly misdiagnosed. I will.
And I was here when she brought this forward at a previous occasion. She's outlined the issues for what the depersonalisation disorder is, but I was quite alarmed whenever I did some research on it. And there's the Honourable Lady, I'm sure she does know these figures, but according to studies in both United Kingdom and the US, DPD affects some 2% of the population, 1.3 million people in the United Kingdom, 6.4 million people in the US. Is there a greater need not just to raise awareness, which the Honourable Lady is quite clearly doing here today, but also to raise awareness within the GPs to ensure that they can diagnose early, understand what it is, and then respond to it?
I absolutely agree with the Honourable Gentleman, and it's something I come on to later in my piece, because I do talk about just how many people do experience this condition and what other conditions have similar numbers of people who are diagnosed that are far more common and are treated. They have more resources from the NHS. And I am going on to argue that, frankly, given the numbers of people, it is fairly significant, and we do need to put more resources and more effort into assisting those. Because many of the sufferers, as I said, are misdiagnosed, often for years on end. And when somebody with depersonalised disorder, with this personalisation disorder is misdiagnosed, they can often be given medication. And that medication can be just simply having a little effect, or it could be quite harmful. So whilst naming the symptoms and understanding what's happened to them can be for people a really important experience, actually understanding, putting a name to what you have can make somebody feel an awful lot better. My constituent, Jane Charlton, struggled terribly before she was diagnosed. She imagined that she might have a degenerative disease or that she might be dying. But learning the name of her condition was a crucial step in understanding it, living with it, and eventually learning ways of dealing with it. The onset of DPD for Jane was triggered by cannabis use. She was just 18, on holiday with a boyfriend at the time, and she'd smoked cannabis just once before. Her boyfriend prepared her some cannabis resin, mixed it into a yoghurt. Jane tried a little, no impact, so she tried a bit more. And then she describes what happened next, and I quote, "My perception drew back into my head, almost as though I was now looking at the world from the back of my own eye sockets. I perceived a delay between the external event and my brain understanding or processing it. Suddenly, there was a fracture between the world and me, and while my body was still in the world, my mind had become a disengaged observer." As I said, with DPD, the individual is aware that their perception has changed. So although the experience feels like a blurring or a distancing, for Jane, it was terrifying. And again, I quote, "During that first episode, hours followed where I sought reassurance from those around me, wanting to touch and talk to them constantly. I wanted to check that I still existed. Eventually, exhausted, I slept in the hope that it would pass overnight. But it didn't. The next morning, the shift in perception remained and would in fact remain for every second of every day for the next 3 years." A temporary experience of depersonalisation can serve as a defence mechanism from a traumatic event. It allows separation from your immediate reality, but if it spreads beyond that and becomes depersonalisation disorder, people like Jane can become separated from other emotions as well. Jane says, "If I quiet my mind, I can almost taste the colour and richness of life as I knew it before. But I can barely remember what it feels like. These days, I'm in a constant state of grief. I feel as if I'm grieving my own death, even if I seem to be around to witness it." I think it's hard to imagine the impact that this would have on a young person's life, for those of us who haven't felt it. And 3 years in Jane's case with no diagnosis and no remedy. But even with the right diagnosis, DPD is hard to treat. Jane has had 4 major episodes of depersonalisation disorder, despite all of her hard work and often with experts in her field. Her current episode is ongoing and it's entering its 5th year. Another person who has depersonalisation is someone called Joe Perkins. He runs a YouTube channel and it's called the DPD Diaries, which is a wonderful, accessible resource, I think, for learning about the condition. Joe told me that he has had around 100 medical appointments over the last 10 years, but he can count the number of professionals who actually had heard of the condition on one hand. His diagnosis took 10 years, and that's sadly a normal length of time in our NHS at the moment. 10 years of living with it and not understanding this was a recognised medical condition. Not understanding for Joe that he wasn't on his own. And this is how he explains his experience of the condition, and I quote, "The most difficult for me to deal with day by day is a complete lack of emotions. I experience neither happiness or sadness. Life feels completely flat, and it's difficult to feel motivated for anything when everything feels meaningless. Having to explain to your partner that you're unable to feel love for them is an incredibly difficult conversation to have, and one that naturally puts a huge strain on any relationship, and I'm sure we can all understand that." Joe first started experiencing symptoms whilst he was studying for A-levels, when he was in fact too young to be eligible at the Maudsley Clinic, which is the only facility in the UK. Fortunately, he has started to receive treatment. The referral took a full year and the waiting list is long, with numbers spiralling as awareness rightly grows. But the invisibility of DPD makes it all the more important that we speak about it and in this place. And I'm grateful to have the opportunity to do just that today. Just a few facts will show that depersonalisation and derealisation, a closely related condition, are an urgent concern and need far better treatment under the NHS. Firstly, depersonalisation and derealisation have symptoms that many of us will feel familiar. 75% of us will have experiences similar to depersonalisation at some point in our lives. And secondly, as the Honourable Member from Strangford said, between 1 and 2.4% of people are likely to actually have this condition. That it is similar in levels to bipolar disorder, which is far better understood, much more resourced, and our GPs and our experts are able to spot it. And thirdly, I think it's really important for us to know that there is only one small clinic in the UK which specialises in treating the condition. And it doesn't, as I've said, treat people who are under the age of 18. And that is despite the fact that those who have depersonalisation typically have their first experience of that in their adolescence. And finally, and rather damningly, I think, the average diagnosis from the point of symptoms appearing takes between 8 to 12 years. And these are the facts I've had. And I've talked about what DPD actually is and what actually feels like, and the fact that it's very poorly known, which helps to explain the most unbelievable figure of 8 to 12 years to diagnosis. How debilitating DPD can be is the most important thing to understand, but the lack of experience of provision is extremely important too. So I think we've got a lot of work to do if we're going to build the same scale and quality of NHS support for those with DPD as for those with depression or bipolar disorder. And I'd like to, at this moment, pay tribute to Jane for all the work that she has done on this issue. She's a brave woman. She featured in a Guardian article in 2015, which reached a huge number of people. And in 2017, she followed that up with an appearance on the Victoria Derbyshire programme. And during that programme, several people called into the show to say that Jane had helped them to recognise their own symptoms. Jane continues to raise awareness through lobbying, and she lobbied me. She also runs a peer support group for people suffering from DPD to share experiences and to solidarity. And she's also founded a charity called Unreal to unify all the different bits of work that's being done. Jane's done all of this while holding down a full-time job and dealing with her own DPD. She has my absolute respect and gratitude for this. Jane's work is really helping, but I think we need to go so much further to spread awareness not only just around members of the public, but also the NHS professionals as well. So as I said at the start, Jane, Dr Hunter and myself have already met with the Minister, and I'm hopeful that the Minister will be able to tell us a bit more about what action is being taken. But I'd like to use this opportunity to put on record our 4 asks. All of them we think can be accomplished within the next few years. None of them we think would require huge investment in terms of resources. So firstly, training. A 2017 edition of the British Medical Journal published new guidance on the assessment and management of DPD, and this was very welcome, but it hasn't and won't lead to better and faster diagnosis and treatment in and of itself. So my first ask is that the Minister writes to the President of the Royal College of General Practitioners and the Royal College of Psychiatrists to request that they bring this information to the attention of their members and ensure that training on DPD may be made part of the core training for GPs and psychiatrists in future. Secondly, I would ask the Minister to push for the design and delivery of a programme of training NHS mental health trusts around the country to raise awareness, but also improve assessment and management of the disorder at a local level. I think that possibly should include the appointment of a local depersonalisation disorder lead who can provide thereafter guidance to local clinicians. My third request is that those leads link together to improve access to treatment with those with the condition. I think that the Minister would agree with me that it's not good enough just to have one small clinic at the Maudsley treating all of those people that have depersonalisation across the country. We need better and more. And finally, given that expert support for young people experiencing DPD doesn't exist within the NHS, I'd ask the Minister ensures that there is specialist provision within CAMS to make sure that those under 18 can receive treatment when they need it. I think these very simple steps could make a difference, potentially bringing down that average diagnosis time from the absurd and unacceptable 8 to 12 year level at which it currently stands, and that they will help to ensure that no matter where someone lives, if they go to their GP, help will be available. So many people live in silence with this largely invisible condition. We have a long way to go to guarantee effective diagnosis and treatment for them on the NHS, but I hope that these 4 asks, if realised, would help to start us down a good path.
Thank you, Lord Price.
Thank you, Mr. Gray. It's a pleasure to serve with your chairmanship this morning. And it's also a great pleasure to respond to the debate raised by the Honourable Member for West Ham. As she says, we have met to discuss this before, and I would also like to extend my thanks to her constituent Jane, who has been incredibly courageous in how she despite living with a condition which is profoundly distressing for her to manage, has nonetheless used that in such a positive way. And frankly, the most important thing that we can all do is really raise awareness of this disorder, and she's doing it beautifully and is incredibly articulate in how she does it, and I pay absolute tribute to her. She certainly put it on my radar, so I'm delighted to have this opportunity to discuss this in the House and do our bit to raise awareness, because as the Honourable Lady has mentioned, 8 to 12 years before getting a diagnosis isn't good enough. And the reason that people wait for that long is because this is a disorder that is not understood. But it's also fair to say that many personality disorders are misunderstood. We tend to lump mental ill health and disorders together, but they require very different ways of treating it. And quite often, when it comes to disorders, medication is not the best solution. So it is very important that we get diagnosis right, and the way we'll do that is actually by raising awareness of what, as the Honourable Member for Strangford said, is a very common condition. And I think many of us might have had out-of-body experiences when we're going through something that's unpleasant, because that's the way that the body naturally copes with trauma. But when you're going through sustained trauma, like many sufferers of DPD have, then it becomes a way of dealing with life. And actually the worst thing is, as she's highlighted, that this can actually be brought on by drug use. Now, I don't think we should be squeamish about mentioning this. We've got a debate going on about drugs at the moment, which is all about we've lost the war against drugs. It's all done through this lens of crime and disorder. The reality is that the extent of cannabis use in this country is contributing to our mental health crisis. Of that, I have no doubt. And I don't think we should be squeamish about saying it. So, again, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady to give me the opportunity to do exactly that. So we must make sure we do better. Last year, I had the great privilege of chairing the Women's Mental Health Task Force. And we saw there that quite often we were seeing a greater scale of mental ill health experienced by women between the ages of 16 to 24. And we put at the root of that much of that was due to trauma. And so we have a strategy to really roll out much more trauma-informed care across the NHS. And I would hope that that would also extend to greater awareness of this disorder. I think the point she makes about making sure that GPs and practitioners are more aware of this in this training is a very, very good one. And again, I think we need to think collectively as a system what more we can do to educate the whole NHS about the difference between severe mental health brought on by other conditions and things that are brought on by things like trauma and the whole issue of disorders, so that we're not just medicalising treatment through drugs, but we're also putting together that kind of wraparound support care and really giving people the tools with which to manage what are often debilitating conditions. As I say, I greatly enjoyed meeting Jane and the clinicians from the South London Maudsley NHS Foundation Trust last year. And it was a very compelling presentation. And I think we do need to explore more about this condition so that we actually do get this right. As I said, the causes or triggers of this condition are poorly understood, but may be related to previous trauma. And we've heard about some of those today. And again, I think the more we can do, the Honourable Lady mentioned about more support within CAMS. Again, a lot of this trauma is sustained and starts in childhood. So I would really hope that we, in spreading awareness of this, an important tool will be the new children's mental health teams that will be going out into schools. And what we're looking for is for them to be able to, for mental health leads within schools to be able to refer people to them that they sense are having some difficulties, so that we can get that early intervention in to support children. Because we know that the longer they live with this ongoing trauma, the worse it is for them to manage it. And without going into individual cases, because it's very distressing for them, I'm certainly aware of cases where adults are now living with this disorder, having gone through sustained trauma in childhood, and clearly we need to find a way of dealing with that. I think we've come a long way in breaking down mental health stigma and raising awareness of conditions, but I'd repeat again that there is this complete, real lack of awareness about disorders. We now talk broadly about bipolar or borderline personality disorder, but do people really know what it means? I don't think so, and I think we do need to expand our education around that. Now, as the Honourable Lady has mentioned, at the moment there's just one clinic that specialises in this, and I think it's partly because of the lack of awareness. It's fair to say that the research evidence around what works for this treatment is still at a very early stage. And obviously the NHS will support further investment in those treatments based on evidence. And at this point, we do lack a nice guideline for the treatment of DPRD. So that's something that must be on the to-do list. But essentially in doing that, we will need to find out more about this disorder. This is a learning process for everyone, and obviously people like Jane are contributing massively to this. But it's for clinicians and researchers to do their best and really get to grips with what will be required. But I would acknowledge that this is the world-class work that is being undertaken at the Maudsley. It is one of the leading research and clinical treatments for this condition in the world. It's pioneered an incredible service which Jane herself was praised to the hilt in terms of what it's done for her health and really works to improve the health outcomes for patients. They are dedicated to really expanding the understanding and treatment of depersonalisation through their research. And I really encourage them because further research is vital for improving our understanding of the prevalence of this condition and its treatment. Now, I understand that the Maudsley successfully assessed over 500 people since the inception of its service, which is amazing. But back to the 2% who suffer from it, more to do. They're also working very closely with the research unit at King's College London, which is also adding to that understanding. But clearly, waiting 9 to 12 months for therapy once you've had a diagnosis really isn't good enough. So I'm pleased to say that the department held an initial roundtable meeting at the end of last year to hear about the work of the service provided by South London Maudsley NHS Trust and to discuss current research into those treatments and suggestions on NHS management of the condition. and we look forward to taking forward that work further. We also discussed with the Maudsley the options for next steps, including applying for a development grant with the National Institute for Health Research's Mental Health Policy Research Unit. Now, I understand the team at the specialised units at the Maudsley has faced previous challenges acquiring such funding in the past. It is a bit chicken and egg. We need evidence to get the money for research, but you need the money for research to feed the evidence. I completely understand that, but I will say to the Honourable Lady that the DHSC research team will work with them to discuss the type of research that would be the most appropriate for them to bid for. And, you know, clearly we want to make sure that we are making the most of their expertise and expanding our understanding of this condition. So I hope that this brings some reassurance, and I look forward to seeing further developments in this space. Yes.
Brown?
As always, delighted with what she's just offered us. I think it's great. I wouldn't be, and especially around the research, fantastic, thank you very much. But I wouldn't be me if I didn't press her on the three things that now is still off that list, and that is writing to the President of the Royal College of GPs, the one of psychiatry, a programme of training for mental health trusts and access to treatment for under 18s. And I'm happy for her to write to me on that.
I'd like to take that away and actually discuss that with the clinical lead in the NHS to see how best we do it, because I agree with her, but I think I'd like to take this about in the broader context of disorders and really getting that understanding between severe mental health conditions and ongoing disorders that need different tools. But I will write back to her, and I know we'll continue to have dialogue on this issue. So in conclusion, Mr Gray, I would very readily acknowledge that there is still a lot of work to be done to support people with this disorder and to help them make a full recovery with treatment and support. But I can assure the House that this is very much on my to-do list. I look forward to having further dialogue with the Honourable Lady and with Jane, and I wish Jane every success with the way she's managing her condition. And I hope I provide a sufficient reassurance today that we are absolutely committed to doing what we can for these people. Thank you.
Question is, this House considered the NHS treatment for depersonalisation disorder. Please say aye. Contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. And I suspend the sitting until 2:30 o'clock this afternoon. Out of order. You will see, Prime Minister.